Good evening, Matt.
Hey Graham, great to see you.
Great to see you. Welcome, everyone, to Crazy in Love, the podcast where two therapists talk about all things relationships. Tonight, Matt, we're going to talk about the difference between what a lot of people think is the reason or the way relationships end, which is a lot of fire, a lot of arguments, and maybe affairs. And the difference
Yeah.
between that and what we see maybe in our couples work and what the evidence suggests, which is that a lot of couples either end their relationship or continue in their relationship in ways that are deeply sad and unhappy, right? The vast majority, I think it's only something like three quarters of relationships where there's some sort of affair don't end in the ending of the relationship, don't end in divorce. That's an awful lot of people who have that heat and that fire, but don't actually end their relationship. Whereas the evidence suggests that there's something like 15% or so, 20% or so of people who report being deeply unhappy in their current long-term relationship. A fifth of people have reported feeling trapped in their relationship because they don't see an end in sight. They can't afford to leave. They've got kids, so they don't feel like they can leave. They're emotionally tied to their partner, but unhappy, for example. Let's kick us off by kind of maybe exploring whether you see that in your couple's work, that kind of slow creep of unhappiness and contempt and bitterness, maybe.
Yeah, definitely. I would say it's a large part of the work. So I definitely see people who have gone outside of the relationship and had affairs, and people who've done more sort of meaningless stuff, erotic massage,
Mm,
that kind of thing. And they've been typically that's a guy who's been busted for doing that, and sometimes that will precipitate a couple coming to marriage therapy. Affairs relatively commonplace, or just a kind of dalliance with somebody that hasn't led to anything. Never know quite the full story, do you? But that's often the story that's being told. But much more common are couples who have arrived together, I think, both aware that it's not what it was, that they fell in love, that they even adored one another not so very long ago, and now they don't. Now it's boring, or now it's argumentative, or
mm,
the fire's gone, the passion's gone, and often their sex life has gone as well. And that's, I think, one of those things that you can put your finger on and is sort of
mm,
harder to argue against. So lots of couples tell
mm.
me that they're busy and they wonder whether it's normal and all of those sorts of things. But most people, I think, have a sneaking sense that if they're not connecting in a meaningful way physically, it's probably an indication of something important.
Yeah, the research that I was looking at, the surveys suggest, I know there are self-report surveys, so taken with a bit of
Yeah, absolutely.
salt, but men were reporting more frequently than women that their unhappiness in the relationship and the marriage is more to do with a lack of sex, a lack of physical intimacy. Women generally report more unhappiness around money, around feeling trapped because of money, but also that kind of lack of fun. And by lack of fun, I'm interpreting that as, yes, going out and having fun together, but also kind of lack of fun day to day, lack of connection, lack of
Yeah.
vibrancy, lack of
Yeah.
energy in the relationship as well.
Yeah. It made me think of sort of no fault divorce, like it's a very modern phenomenon, isn't it? It's sort of no one did anything wrong, nobody strayed, nobody was violent or aggressive or controlling necessarily. It just ran out of steam. We sort of accept that as quite a common story, and I'd give lots of credit to the couples who turn up in therapy, because they're having a go at fixing something that once was, usually in my experience, lovely for them and wonderful. And they did have very strong feelings for one another, and now they sometimes have almost no feelings.
And we'll come on later on in the conversation to talk about what couples should do in that situation. But why do you think people stick around and maybe don't talk about it? So there's the couples that I work with. Often there's an acknowledgement on an individual level that they've had that slow creep towards unhappiness, but maybe haven't confronted that together until something
Yeah.
big happens, like an affair, or one of them feels like they're
Yeah.
right at the end and about to leave. Why do you think
Or,
couples?
or you just can't deny anymore that
Yeah,
it's been a
right.
year and you haven't had
Yeah,
sex. The last time you did that together was on holiday, or was an
Right.
anniversary or someone's birthday, or Christmas has rolled around again. I see an absolute ton of sexless relationships where there's
Yeah.
no medical biological problem on either side, and there's no reason that couples are opting out of that. There's no choice involved. It's happened and they're really
Yeah.
unhappy about it. Sort of choice is probably inverted commas, isn't it, in that sentence?
Yeah. Yeah. But
Sorry,
there's
I lost your question there. You were
well,
asking me
but there was
something
there's often
important.
a lack of confrontation within the relationship of something being not good enough. Whether
I suppose that is part of my answer, the one I've given already, because it's so flipping hard, isn't it, to
I
imagine
agree.
you come back from that. Like, what do we do? Well, we both know there's a problem. Like, let's stick with that example of sexlessness within the marriage, but how do we fix that? What are we going to do? And there's a reason for that. It's because somebody's been initiating or trying to, and it's been rebuffed, or you've both been trying to, and on alternating occasions the other person has ignored you or not responded or whatever else. So there are pretty good reasons for it going wrong. Even if you knew what they were, what on earth would you do to put that right? That's the point at which I see couples. I always think it's a shame people haven't come much sooner and don't treat couples therapy a bit more like a service, a bit more like an MOT, a bit more like something that you might do annually,
Yeah.
to get ahead of the problem or to keep ahead of the thing, keep the machine running, so to speak. I often see people when it's gotten pretty desperate, and that's, I think, usually beyond the wit of the couple to solve.
It's interesting though, isn't it? I agree with the fundamental point you're making that it's hard to confront. It plays into that myth that relationships should be easy.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
That if something is wrong, we need to avoid it because it's this elephant in the room that if we do go near, we
yeah,
might have to confront that we're not making each other happy, and therefore we might need to leave, and all the horrible ramifications
yeah.
of that. I wonder if there are a few other elements to it, kind of the stigma attached to it, that people that it's not a common thing to talk about with your friends, both
Yeah,
in terms
agree.
of kind of lack
Agree.
of sex in your relationship, but also just general unhappiness. We tend to want to convince other people that our relationships are relatively strong. So
Yeah.
I know you've called me out on this before in other elements, this idea that maybe women talk with their friends more about their relationships than men do. But I don't imagine there's a huge number or a huge percentage of women that confide in their friends that actually their relationship is emotionally unfulfilling, or they're not getting as much sex in their relationship as they want to. I don't imagine that's happening regularly.
No, I don't. No, I don't either. I mean, to some extent, how would we know? But I mean,
Yeah.
from the clinical work, from meeting people,
Yeah,
day
exactly.
in and day out, and talking to women extensively about this, it isn't quite that level of disclosure. And what do you do with it? And how do you react when someone's telling you that? And you probably, I mean, blokes are classic for this, and they're trying to cheer one another up, make each other laugh, put them in a different kind of frame of mind. And I think that's a fairly universal thing. Like, it isn't a therapy session, even if you are talking about emotions over wine. I mean, you're not necessarily doing anything terribly constructive, are you? You might be co-ruminating, or you might be sharing like some problems in your relationship. In terms of actually working through to a resolution, what would that couple then go away and do differently? I don't think women are any better or have any better resources for resolving those problems in my limited experience.
Yeah, I think there's also a train of thought or a cultural thing of, well, what did you expect? Like, relationships are not going to be perfect. You're 20 years in. Did you expect your sex life to
Yeah,
still continue? So there's almost like this,
yeah,
again, a stigma attached to raising it, and maybe a pushback from friends and loved ones, and maybe family messages, cultural messages of, well, what did you expect? Something that people like us might play into from time to time when we do talk about managing your expectations for long-term relationships, that your sex life isn't going to be as good as it was
yeah.
maybe 10
But
years.
I think that's the bit that it is worth trying to be thorough and
I
analytical
agree.
about, and
I
like
agree.
really serious minded about, because I think there's a world of difference between a relationship which is steady state, we like one another very much, we support one another, and we're basically having a nice time together, and we connect physically, not like we did when we were in our 20s or when we were lying around at university and there wasn't much else on and everything was easy breezy. But it's still a nice relationship, a good one. Even that's a world apart from a relationship which has really run out of steam and it lacks joy and both parties are finding it unsatisfying. It's morphed into something which is actually a strain and takes away the pleasure from life. So
Yeah.
there's some sensible middle ground, isn't there? If
I
you're 10 or 20 years in, or even 2 years in, it just ain't going to feel like it did at first.
strongly agree.
But it doesn't have to feel horrid or unsatisfactory. We could just recognize that the way you and I would play football now with our kids or with some friends is different from how we would have done it, 20 years ago.
You
But
always
it's
bring it back
still
to football. Somewhere along the line, you're going to get back to a football analogy. I don't
it's
want
still okay. It's hangovers, isn't it? We know that at this stage of life, if you choose to go out drink, you are going to feel the effect the following day and thereafter. Our bodies just don't work in the same way. But going out and having fun, like if that's still something that you value, you can still do that at this stage in the relationship. You can still have fun together, even if it is a different kind of fun. It's pottering around. It's looking after the kids.
Yep.
It's in the house beautiful. It's having people over for simple food rather than going to the latest fancy pants restaurant.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Definitely. There's a difference as well between temporary dissatisfaction in a relationship. A lot of the,
Yeah,
again,
it's a great point.
self-report data is uh, particularly soon after children, satisfaction in the relationship dips significantly. But something like 2/3 of the couples that say they're unhappy in those first year or so of having children, by 5 years, 10 years down the line, vast majority of them, those two-thirds plus, say that they're happy again, right? So there's something about
Yeah,
temporary unhappiness and
yeah,
temporary stagnation that a lot of those couples are finding their way back together. There's a big difference between that and what we're talking about here, which is much more that prolonged, deep sadness. And I don't want to underestimate quite how awful it can be to be in a
yeah.
long-term 20+ year relationship with someone who, and share a house with someone and share a bathroom with someone who you just feel like you're walking past each other and just not connecting. That
Yeah,
such
I think there's something. I'm with you on most of that. I suppose those years have genuinely passed. If you rediscover, like actually you are happy, or you're glad you stayed, or it gotten better, those were real years. They were real hours. They were real days. I think there is something about that message for me is just a little bit too hopeful, or a bit too like just it will pass. I think there's something more active because I see
I
couples
agree.
who,
I agree.
yeah,
Yeah, and maybe the phraseology wasn't right. I said they kind of find each other again, almost as if by accident in the bedroom. You just kind of bump into each other and reconnect. No, I agree. I think a lot of those couples will have gone to couples therapy. A lot of those couples will have had to say, "Hang on a minute, we have totally lost each other here.
yeah,
What are we going to do once the kids become
yeah.
toddlers, and maybe we can get babysitters in more often? And when we go out for dinner, let's talk about our relationship." I don't
Yeah,
suggest that that's a passive experience. I think it has to be quite an active one.
there's quite a common phase, I think, in relationships where the child or the last child is off to university or whatever. Again, a bit of a sort of middle class example, but they're fleeing the nest, right? That last sort of kid is going, and it's dawning on both of them that it's us now, and there's usually a gap, isn't there, between the grandchildren appearing, if that's what's going to come next in your life. And it's like, what on earth do we do now? So that would be a common point at which I see couples where they're approaching that. They might not be as explicit as that, and they might, not even have a sense that their child is leaving at a very conscious level. That might not be on their mind, but that's often a point at which couples will come because they realize like the task that they did together that they enjoyed and that they were pretty good at is over. And it's now just them, perhaps with less work or no work, or anticipating retirement in due course. And it's dawned on them that, maybe they are not as happy and content as they thought they were.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that even if you're in a relatively stable relationship, suggest there are certain key periods where those kind of check-ins and MOTs that you were
Yeah,
describing might be particularly useful. I think that's one. I think just before children is one,
yeah,
or
agreed.
maybe a few years into having children, and certainly that period of time before you're then almost forced back to spending a
Yeah,
large number of hours every day together in kind of
yeah,
retirement or post-children, post
yeah,
teenage
yeah.
children leaving the house.
They're really big changes, aren't they? I think that's that's my humdrum observation. They really are significant phases of life, and that sort of me in my life with my two boys now. When they got to school, I guess the older one would have been a couple of years, school years older. When the younger one entered into school on a full-time basis. It's like, oh, that really felt different, you know, felt like
Mm.
they could reliably do things for themselves, obviously taken care of by somebody else for large swathes of the day, but just their degree of independence in the home, it felt like it was a very big shift. I think for some women, that would be the point at which, in that kind of setup, they would confidently return to work, perhaps not full time, but you know, much more like it. That bit's sort of over. So that feels like a very big, significant shift as well. I see that
Yeah.
couples in that phase of life, as well as ones who are just gotten pregnant, or they've got a tiny little one and they're in the trenches in those early
Mm.
weeks and months,
Mm. Mm.
feel like significant plot points through family life anyway.
Yeah, yeah, and potentially some big feelings to have to confront and talk about that maybe you haven't had time and space to. So I think those first 2 or 3 years of raising children, and then the return to work, the primary school, the introduction to primary school, that sense of space that creates,
Yeah,
but a lot of feelings in those 3 4 years that probably haven't had space, and you as a couple haven't had capacity to talk about why you're
yeah,
feeling angry
yeah,
with each other or annoyed. it's
yeah.
it's bunker territory that first year or so, isn't
Yeah,
it?
it is, isn't it? I think that is the thing that I would say anecdotally, that women seem to do better, that there is a bit of language around what it can feel like to have a child, and how lost you can feel, and how
Yeah,
exhausted you can be, and how the changes in your body might show up as sort of changes in your mental health, and you might experience a depression, and that is, you know, way less taboo than it would have been, you know, in the past, and it can be spoken about. And the sort of campaign that dads get sad too is sort of mocked mostly, you know, or just, you know, not really reach people's attention. But it's very different for dads too. Like, you were the thing, you were the person, you did feel like a priority. You know, it's often what people get into relationships for, to feel special, to give and exchange love and affection, and suddenly you're way down the pecking order, right?
absolutely.
And I think
Absolutely.
quite hard for guys to talk about that, you know, because we don't want to be needy and weak and pathetic, and we know that we're not the main event, and we sort of get that at a cognitive level. But there's something, I think, quite I don't be too po-faced about it, but there's something quite profound about that as well
I
for
agree.
guys.
Yeah, I agree. Let's come on to and we can use some of those touch points as examples if we want to, but what would you advise to couples who come, and how do you work with those couples that do come to you and say, 10 years ago, we loved each other very much. We were interested in each other. We'd have sex quite frequently. We enjoyed each other's company, and it feels like we've just lost each other. I imagine I've got in my mind a range of different maybe principles or areas of their life that you'd help them work with. Start us off, and I'll help build on it.
Yeah, I don't know whether this is where I always start. In fact, it's not where I always start. But I think one interesting thing to try and get to is what did draw us together? Like, what was the good bit of the relationship? Why did we like one another? And do we still like some of those things about one another? Because often, once the problems show up, it's all problems, or we end up sort of compounding problems rather than thinking about the things that we enjoy about one another. So I quite like to hear couples say that they admire the work ethic of the other person, or you know, that somebody is terrific with the kids, or you know, brilliant dad, or an amazing mum, or whatever else, or a great friend, or somebody who really looks out for family members, and those sorts of things, so that we start to, I guess, just get back in touch with what is admirable about the other person. It can get a bit I guess a bit all or nothing in those
Mm.
situations. And I'm also trying to test out, you know, in the sort of terms that you and I would understand, whether we're trying to save the relationship, so to speak, or whether or not actually there is a parting, you know. So if we've run out of any kind of goodwill or good feelings towards the other person, there's probably very little, honestly, you can do. It may well be that the relationship has run its course. But I think where there are signs of hope, we like one another, we still have fun together, it's still really funny when we go out or when we host, or you know, those sorts of things might be you know, clues that we are working on something.
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
often couples won't want to say that they're finished, they won't want to say that to themselves, they won't want to say that to one another. But I'm sort of, I guess, looking for some clues as to whether this is,
Yeah,
yes,
and particularly based on what we were talking about earlier, that there will be an awful number of people that feel trapped.
yeah,
So it's a minority, but it's a sizable minority of people who feel like they wish they'd married someone else. I think something like
yeah,
15% of people reported that they wish they'd married someone else,
yeah.
which I imagine if you're feeling a bit rubbish in the relationship, you probably do wish you'd married someone else. So again, take it with a pinch of salt. But there will be some people that are coming to couples therapy thinking, in effect, I'm not sure there's anything to save here. I'm not sure about that. They probably come with a bit of optimism in the main, in my experience, that they want to work hard to try and save it, but they're a bit skeptical about that. And I think that is worth saying up front, that there will be, again, a minority of couples, but there will be some couples that when you do try and do that work where you're saying reconnect with what you loved about this person, what is it about them that interests you and excites you? Maybe they've lost connection to that. Maybe
Yeah,
that
yeah,
person has kind of
yeah.
deflated and isn't as present as it used to be.
Yeah, I agree, and I mean, I'm not, I'm not obsessed with saving the relationship. I mean, I think some of them, it's up to the couple what they want to do, right? It might not be up to both of them equally. If someone wants to leave and the other person doesn't want to leave, that's really regrettable, isn't it? But it's certainly not up to me. The reason I'm trying to reconnect with those things is I think they're often the other side of the coin, like they're often the rub. So if you liked someone being organized and conscientious and those sorts of things at first, and you saw the value in that and what it brought to your life, and that you were maybe missing some of that, it sort of rounded out, smoothed out your edges. It then gets on your nerves typically. Somebody who's got a lot of fire or ambition, or is incredibly hardworking, those sorts of things, really admirable in the first instance, and then it's much less fun when they're never coming home for dinner and they're still taking calls late and holidays are interrupted and weekends are not your own, and all of those sort of go-getting things can become quite an irritant. So I'm partly looking for the other side of it as well, because I think that's where the reset would need to be typically. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I think that's a really interesting point. Uh, that,
And I guess there's some communications tools, aren't there? I think even in relationships where there's been something spectacular going on, and infidelity, or really fiery and repeated arguments that are dramatic and go on for hours or repeat very often, there's some sort of communications breakdown. I think couples therapists are guilty of saying everything's about communications, but there is a kernel of truth in there, right? If you can't have a conversation about difficult things in life, you're not going to go for more than 2 years. You're not going to do a decade together. You're not going to do 2, 3 decades
yeah.
of a good quality relationship, because there will be, many, many bumps in the road. So just some tools for talking to one another, keeping in mind how you position your requests, or the way you speak to the other person, how you hear that when your partner talks to you, whether you're doing that roughly as adult to adult rather than parent to child or child to parent, was very easy to slip into. And then just a sense of when somebody says something to you, what's your immediate response? Is it to argue? Is it to defend your
Yeah.
position? Is it to roll your eyes or zone out or leave the room, or whatever else, or just wait it out and try and get them to run out of steam? Or is it a much more active, engaged process where you're trying to acknowledge what's being said, you're perhaps building your contribution into that, and then if you need to, you're challenging that, or you're contradicting them in some important respect? And then do they do the same to you? Do they hear what you're offering? Do they try and build on that, and do they offer their corrective, and so on and so forth, until we've got something like a resolution? And when I see couples speak to one another, it's often very interesting as a couples therapist to hear the couple talk to one another, not to tell you the story, but to talk to one another and to disagree about something. Very few times will I see a model where each person is able to acknowledge the point of view of the other, not necessarily accept that as correct in the final,
Yeah. Yeah.
build in some way upon it, and then counter with something meaningful of their own. That very, very seldom. If couples are doing that, they're usually okay.
Yeah. There's something there about frequency, maybe as well, isn't there? That if you're one thing we often talk about is go first, ask for what you want,
Hmm.
instigate sex more often, but certainly
Hmm.
with the kind of communication, go first, be the one that names the problem, be the one that
Yeah.
asks for something different.
Yeah.
But I imagine you see, well, like I see, which is one party in the couple is often bringing a lot more than the other, and it can feel, rather
Yeah.
than feeling like a request, it can feel like 5 or 6 times a day there's a problem, there's
Yeah.
another
Sure.
thing that
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
problematic, so it
Yeah.
doesn't feel like that nice collaborative, curious conversation about, oh, there's something not quite right here, and let's have a
Yeah,
conversation about it. It feels just like a laundry list of
yeah.
stuff that isn't right about that relationship or that person.
I think they can be really brief, those conversations as well. Like I don't think you or I are necessarily looking for long conversations in those moments. Like
Far
at
from it.
our best in our own relationships, we're naming the thing that we would like. We know that it's a preference and we're going to try and hold it flexibly. We're going to put it to the other person in a succinct way that's respectful. It's not carrying any kind of lecture with it. There's no ultimatum. There's just hey, I would really appreciate it if kind of construction. And then if you're met with that, it's understood. And the other person says, yeah, I've been thinking the same. Or, okay, I wasn't aware that's like what you were worrying about, but I get it. And, how about this as the compromise? We're over, we're done. It's 20
Yeah.
seconds if you want it to be.
I agree with all that. I wonder if we're getting a bit too much in the weeds too early, in the sense
Mm,
that often the big thing is to confront the sadness, to confront the drift.
yeah, sure.
And that sometimes I work with couples where it feels like they're coming with a kind of, they're saying we're arguing too much, or we're not kind of connecting. But what they don't necessarily front up to is like, I've been really unhappy for 5 years, or I feel like I've lost you and
Mm,
I'm not sure I'm in love with you anymore. Those big kind of
yeah.
reasons underneath. And I
Yeah.
guess one thing to maybe note and to bank is that someone needs to step up and do that.
Yeah,
Ideally.
I agree. I guess I think those things are quite hard to unravel. And what I tend to see, I mean, challenge me on this, but what I tend to see is people behaving fairly poorly towards one another and then saying they don't really love being in the relationship and they're not really loving their time they spend with the other person. And it feels to me a bit like, well, no shit, Sherlock. Did you behave in those ways when you got together on the first date? When you met at uni or wherever you met at work? Was that what you were getting? Someone moaning at you, someone complaining, someone endlessly late for things? Almost certainly not. You would have been charmed by them. Everybody is bringing their best self. And if we completely lose go of that and we complain at one another and we moan at one another and we don't step through the shower for one another or dress up nicely or make an effort and cook, of course, right? What follows, follows. So I don't know whether lots of talking about that and lots of addressing it are always the answer. And I know you share some of that too. So, I mean, I'm not saying this to you, but I just sometimes I hear people come and they want to sort of relitigate a load of past disappointments.
Oh,
And
sure.
sometimes I just want them to go tenpin bowling and do something fun together. If they used to like playing tennis or dancing together or going to art, do that and be kind while we're doing it, right? Appreciate the things that are still you're still able to appreciate about the other person. If there really is nothing to appreciate, it's time to check out probably, isn't it? In all
Yeah.
seriousness. But if
Yeah.
there are
I
things
guess
you
where
admire about them, then that needs foregrounding.
yeah, I think we're talking about couples that are already in couples therapy. I was talking about a moment ago those couples that are just in that prolonged sad place,
Yeah,
that you can stay. It's quite easy to stay there for a long time if you've got
sure.
the mortgage to pay and the kids to raise, etc. You don't confront it. You don't put your
Yeah,
cards on the table and say, I'm unhappy here.
yeah,
You try and find other ways to keep yourself happy and just kind of suck up their unhappiness, right? Whereas I'm
yeah.
saying usually takes one person to put their cards on the table and say,
You agree?
this is not where I want to be. And are we going to
Yeah,
talk about that? Are we going to do anything about it? So even
yeah,
though you're at the stage where you're asking for what you want,
yeah,
you might not even know necessarily what you want. You've just got to kind of face
yeah.
up to,
No, I agree. And without sort of doing semantics on you, I would say, what you want in that situation is a clear-sighted look at it. You want both sets of eyes on it, don't you? What you want is for us to sit down together and say, it's gone wrong. Where did it go wrong? What are we going to do about it? And for me, that would be the thing. It's like, not to talk about it. I mean, yes, there's going to be a talk, isn't there? There's going to be some words. That's all I'm doing in therapy. I'm not getting anyone to draw anything or do anything wacky. We are only talking, but it's like we need to reduce the talking, don't we? We need to do some nice things for one another. We need to appreciate one another again. We need to have fun together. And if we become reliant on that person and we're a bit codependent on them and we don't have our own lives, we need to do additional hobbies. We need to get back into the sport we loved, or we need to go to a class, or we need to reconnect with old friends who we've let,
Yeah.
drop out of our life. Those sorts of
Yeah.
things.
Yeah. And like I think I brought up last time, it's rare that I see a couple where if they're unhappy, they're quite happy in their individual lives outside the
Sure, I,
relationship.
I think you're
They
dead right about that.
they tend to have let other things slip. So the childhood friends might have slipped by. They go into five-side football less often, or they're
Yeah,
hanging out with their mates less often. And it's that sense of your whole life is
yeah,
losing energy. Where are you putting your energy? What are you connecting to? So that when you do come home, you've got stuff to bring, and you're feeling
yeah,
like you're living life rather than just going to the office, coming home, watching Netflix, scrolling on your
yeah,
phone, not talking to each other. And that's
yeah,
when I think
absolutely.
life starts to feel boring and life starts to feel energyless,
Yeah.
rather than a life where you feel like you're grabbing it and you're grabbing it together ultimately.
Agreed. And it's not as simple as this, but I'm always surprised by how little people use family members or friends for babysitting. Their kids are especially unique, and their needs at night time are so profoundly particular that no one else can possibly step in and look after them and keep them alive for 2 or 3 hours for you. And I'm like, when are we going to go out and do the adult thing? When are we going to be partners to one another? How are we possibly going to be lovers if all we're doing is parenting together, or clearing up, or doing tasks? Same goes for bedtimes. I'm surprised by how intelligent, effective people in the world manage to mangle bedtimes and take forever to get children into a bedroom and able to cope with a nightlight and a book before bedtime, or whatever your routine
Yep.
is. That there's no time even to have a meal and decompress together. I don't mean a long extended thing, but just cook something for one another and share the day a bit, or share some TV together. Nothing fabulous, but just you don't need that thing to go on and on and on. Or the children are in
No.
the bed, not really a rant about co-sleeping, but it's like you're probably not going to be having much physical connection, which leads to sex with the kid in the bed. For most people, that wouldn't quite work.
Uh, I think in some ways it's the other way around. In a lot of relationships, it's the I'd quite like to prolong my kid's bedtime because I don't really want to go talk
Yeah,
to him because he's just going to bore on about his day, or he's going to
sure,
ignore me, or he's going to
sure.
tut whenever I
Agree.
talk about my work or
Yeah, I
whatever.
agree.
It
Yeah,
becomes the defense against having to
I
engage
agree.
in a relationship.
Yeah, I agree, and I think it's worth naming that defense. As now, I think it's something that people like you and me can usefully do when someone comes to therapy, like clear-sighted analysis of the problem. But then there is a behavioural choice, right?
Definitely.
If you're not going to decide that it is worth talking at the end of the day, spending a bit of time together. I don't think it needs to be every day. I think it needs to be a long conversation or debrief on the day. If that's not your style and it's not your thing, and your partner doesn't really understand your world of work, I don't think that's obligatory. But if there isn't some way of coming together, sometimes I think you're into a big problem there, unless you want to live slightly parallel lives. And I mean, I've got no particularly strong view on that, other than to say it doesn't seem to be what most people do want. They seem to want more than that. Co-parenting and paying bills together, and sharing a property doesn't seem to be enough for most people.
Good. Good. Any more football analogies before we finish?
No, that's more than enough. We should away and see how England have got on,
Yeah. Good. Against the mighty Albania.
huh?
Great. Great to see you.
Take care, Graham.
Again soon. Bye.